The economic calculation problem, or more well known as the socialist economic problem, is considered by the capitalists as the greatest argument against socialism. Although the origins of the argument was originally make a statement against centrally planned economy of the Leninist tradition, many use it as socialism in general, regardless of school of thought, is impossible by default. Is there any validity to the problem of the argument, right? Is it truly impossible? In 1920, the right-wing economist Ludwig von Mises declared socialism to be impossible. A leading member of the Austrian School of Economics, he argued this on the grounds that without private ownership of the means of production, there cannot be a competitive market for productive goods, and without market for productive goods, it is impossible to determine their values. Without knowing their values, economic rationality is impossible, and so a social economy which simply be chaos and the absurd output of the senseless apparatus. For Mises. For Mises, socialism met central planning with the economy subject of the control of the supreme authority, which is state capitalism, not socialism actually. If you want to know about the argument, you can read book by Ludwig von Mises, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, or at the Collectivist Economic Planning. While applying his economic calculation argument to Marxist ideas of a future socialist society, his argument, it is claimed, is applicable to all schools of socialist thought, including libertarian ones. It is on the basis of his argument that many right-wingers claim that libertarian or any other kind of socialism is impossible in principle. So, democratic socialism, impossible. Marxism, regardless of school of thought, impossible. Anarchism, regardless of school of thought, impossible. Whatever form of socialism there is out there is impossible by default. So, yet as David Scripture observed from the work against capitalism, it has long been recognized that Mises' argument is logically defective. Even without a market in production goods, their monetary values can be determined. In other words, economic calculation based on prices is perfectly possible in not only libertarian socialism but basically any form of socialism depending how you use it properly. After all, to build a workplace requires so many tunnels of steel, so many bricks, so many hours of work, and so on. If we assume a mutualist society, then the price of these goods can be easily found as the cooperatives in question will be offered their services on the market. These commodities will be in the input of the construction of the production goods, and so the latter's monetary value can be found. Ironically enough, Mises did mention the idea of such mutualist system in his initial essay. Exchange relations between productive goods can only be established on the basis of private ownership of the means of production, he asserted. When the coal syndicate provides the iron syndicate with coal, no price can be formed, except when both syndicates are the owners of the means of production employed in their business. That will not be socialization but workers' capitalism and syndicalism. End quote. However, his argument is flawed for numerous reasons. First and most obvious is socialization, which is the anarchist response, not nationalization like the Marxists, because it's no different than privatization, which I explained in my previous video of the long critique of Marxism. Simply means free access to the means of life. As long as those who join the workplace have the same right and liberty as existing members, then there is a socialization. A market system of cooperatives, in other words, is not capitalist as there is no wage labor involved as new workers become full members of the syndicate with the same rights and freedom as existing members. Thus, there are no hierarchical relationship between the owner and the wage slaves, even if these owners also have to work there. Also, as all workers control the means of production they use, it is not capitalism. Second, nor is such a system usually called, as Mises suggests, syndicalism, but rather mutualism. And he obviously considers the most famous advocate, Proudhon, and his fantastic dreams, quote unquote, of a mutual bank as a socialist. Significantly, Mises subsequently admits that it was misleading to call syndicalism workers' capitalism, although and I quote, este, the workers or the owners of the means of production, it was not genuine socialism, that is centralized socialism. As if we must withdraw productive goods from the market, individual citizens must not dispose of the shares in the means of production which are allowed to them. Syndicalism, i.e., those who do the work, control of it, was the idea of plundering hordes. His followers likewise conclude that secularism was not capitalism. With Hayek stated were many types of socialism, including communism, syndicalism, and guild socialism. Significantly, he indicated that Mises' argument was aimed at system based on the central direction of all economic activity, and so earlier system of more decentralized socialism, like guild socialism or syndicalism, need not concern us here, since it seems now to be fairly general admitted that they provide no mechanism whatever for a rational direction of economic activity. This is quoted by Hayek in The Nature and History of the Problem, page 140 of the Collectivist Economic Planning. Sadly, he failed to indicate who generally admitted such a conclusion. More recently, Murray Rothbard argued the state to impose private shares into the workers in the former Stalinist regime of Eastern Europe as ownership was, and I quote from the Logic of Action number 2, not to be granted the collective or cooperatives or workers or peasants holistically, which could only bring back the ills of socialism in a decentralized and chaotic syndicalist form. End quote. Third, syndicalism usually refers to a strategy, revolutionary unionism, used to achieve libertarian socialism, or in this case, anarcho-communism, rather than the goal itself, as Mises himself noted in a tirade against unions. And I quote, syndicalism is nothing else but the French word for trade unionism. End quote. It could be argued that such mutualist system could be an aim for some syndicalists, although most and are in favor of libertarian communism, a simply fact apparently unknown to Mises. Indeed, Mises' ignorance of syndicalist thought is striking, and for some reason, every libertarian capitalist and anarcho-capitalist. Asserting that the market is a consumer democracy, the syndicalists want to transform it into a producer's democracy. Most syndicalists, however, aim to abolish the market and all aim for workers' control of the production to complement, not replace, consumer choices. Syndicalists, like other anarchists, do not aim for workers' control of consumption as Mises asserts. Given that Mises asserts that the market in which one person can have 1,000 votes and another one is a democracy, quote unquote, its ignorance of syndicalist ideas is perhaps only one aspect of the general ignorance of reality. More importantly, the whole premise of his critique of mutualism is flawed. And I quote, exchange relation in productive goods, he asserts, can only be established on the basis of private property in the means of production. If the coal syndicate delivers coal to the iron syndicates, a price can be fixed only if both syndicates owns the means of production in industry. End quote. This may come as a surprise to many companies whose different workplaces sell each other their products. In other words, capitalism itself shows them workplace owned by the same party, in this case a large company or corporation, can exchange goods via market. That Mises makes such a statement indicates well the firm base of his argument in reality. Thus, a socialist society can be extensive autonomy for its cooperatives just as a large capitalist firm can. So much then for the notion that common ownership makes it impossible for market socialism to work. After all, the libertarian community can just as easily separate the calculation of each part of its enterprise, such a way as to determine the role each cooperative plays in its economy. It can look at each second as if it were a separate entity and appraise it according to the share it contributes, as it is assumed that each section owns, i.e., has use rights over its definitive part. It can then buy from and sell to the other cooperatives, and a profit or loss can be imputed to evaluate the independent action of each cooperative, so their own interests impel the cooperative workers toward the utmost care and assertion of the conduct of their cooperative's affair. So, to refute Mises, we need to only repeat what he himself argued about large corporations. Thus, there can be extensive autonomy for workplace under socialism, and this does not in any way contradict the fact that, and quote from the man himself, all the means of production are the property of the community. End quote. Socialization, in other words, does not imply central planning, but rather free access and free association. In summary, then, Mises confused property rights with use rights, possession with property, and failed to see how a mutualist system of socialized cooperative exchange production can be a viable alternative to the current exploitation and oppressive economic system. Such a mutualist economy also struck at the heart of Mises' claim that socialism was impossible, given that he accepted there may be markets and hence market prices for consumer goods in a socialist economy. He claims of the impossibility of socialism seemed unfounded. For Mises, the problem for socialism was that because of no production good will ever become the object of exchange, it will be impossible to determine its monetary value. The flaw of his argument is clear. Taking, for example, coal, we find that it is both a means of production and a consumption. If a market in consumer goods is possible for a socialist system, then competitive prices for productive goods is also possible as syndicates producing productive goods while also sell the product of their labor to other syndicates or communes. As Mises admitted when discussing one scheme of guild socialism, and I quote, association and sub-association maintain a mutual exchange relationship. They receive and give it as their work owners. Thus, a market and market prices are formed. End quote. Thus, when deciding upon a new workplace, railway, or house, the designer in question to have access to the competitive pricing wish to make their decision. Note that Mrs. argument work against communal ownership. In such a system, the commune would be buying products from the syndicates in the same way as one part of the company can buy products from another part of the same company under capitalism. That good product by self-managed syndicate have market price does not imply capitalism, for as they abolish wage labor and are based on free access, socialization is a form of socialism. As socialist defiant, Mises protestation that it is incompatible with socialism notwithstanding. Murray Rothbard suggests that the self-managed system will fail and a system composed exclusively of self-managed enterprises is impossible and will lead to a calculated chaos and complete breakdown. It is hard to take this argument seriously among other things. Consider, for example, a pre-capitalist society of farmers and artisans. Both groups of people own their own means of production, the land and the tools they use, and the farmers grow crops of the artisans who in turn provide the farmer with the tools they use. According to Goldman, the farmers who had no idea what to grow, nor would the artisan know which tools to buy to meet the demand of the farmer, nor which to use to reduce the working time. Presumably, both farmers and artisans will stay awake at night worrying what to produce, wishing they have a landlord and boss to tell them how to best use their labor and resources, which is fucking ridiculous. Let us add the landlord class to the society. Now the landlords can tell the farmer what to grow as their rent income indicate how to allocate the land to its most productive use. Except, of course, it is still the farmer who decides what to produce. Knowing they will need to pay rent for access to the land, they will decide to devote their rented land to the most profitable use in order to both pay the rent and have enough to live on. Why do they not seek to the most profitable use without need for rent is not explored by Rothbard. Much of the same can be said for artisans subject to a boss, for the worker can evaluate whatever an investment in a specific new tool will result in more income or reduce time laboring, or whatever new product will likely meet the needs of consumers. Moving from pre-capitalist society to a post-capitalist one, it is clear that a system of self-managed cooperative can make the same decision without requiring economic masters. This is unsurprising given that Mises asserts that the boss of a course exercise power over the workers, but the lord of production is the consumer. In which case the boss need not be an intermediary between the real lord and those who do the production. Even then, even if we go into more detail of the argument they do, it's stupid to begin with. And even then, the only make case is about centralized state planned economy of the landless tradition. That said, any of the former socialism, regardless, is either from the Marxist, Democrat, Social Anarchy doesn't talk about. And they only write about certain things about the centralized planned economy. So what? What about anarcho-communism? Is it impossible? Well, the answer is no. While the calculation argument is often used to proprietarians or the libertarian capitalists, as the basis for the argument that communism, a moneyless society, is impossible. It is based on a certain false idea of what prices do, the nature of the market, how the communist anarchist society will function. This is hardly surprising as Mrs. bases theory on a variation of neoclassical economics and the Marxist social democratic and so Leninist idea of what a social economy would look like. So there has been a little discussion of what the true, i.e., anarchist communist society will be like. On the already transformed the existing condition of production by worker self-management and the abolition of both wage labor and money. However, it is useful here to indicate exactly why communism will work and why the calculation argument is flawed as an objection to it. Mises argued that without money there is no way a socialist economy will make a rational production decision. Not even Mises denied that a moneyless society could estimate what is likely to be needed over a given period of time, as expressed as physical quantities of different types and sort of objects. As he argued, and I quote, the calculation in natura in an economy without exchange can embrace consumption goods only, end quote. His argument was the next step, working out which of the productive methods to employ would not be possible, or at least would not be able to be done rationally, i.e., avoiding waste and inefficiency. Potentialities without such an aid, evaluate the producer's good, can only be done with some kind of economic calculation. The human mind cannot orient itself properly among the bewildered mass of intermediate products and potentiality without such aid. It will simply stand perplexed before the problems of management and location, that we could quickly see the spectacle of the social economy, or the floundering in the ocean of possible it could see economic combination without the compass of economic calculation. Hence, the claim that monetary calculation based on market prices is the only solution, apparently. The argument is not without force. How can a producer be expected to know if a tin is a better of use a resource than an iron when creating a product? If all they know is that iron and tin are available and suitable for their purpose, or we have a consumer good which can be made with the A plus B or A plus B, where A and B are both input factors such as steel, oil, electricity, etc. How can we tell which method is more efficient, i.e., which one used the least resource, so left most over for other uses? We make prices. Mises argue it is simple. If A costs $10 and B $5, then clearly method 1 will be the most efficient, $20 versus 25. Without the market, Mises argues such a decision would be impossible, and so every decision would be grouping in the dark. Mises' argument rests on three flawed assumptions, two against communism and one for capitalism. The first two negative associate that communism entails central planning and it is impossible to make investment decisions without money values. We discuss why each is wrong later on. Mises' possible associate for capitalism, namely the markets allow exact and efficient allocation of resource, is discussed. Firstly, Mises assumed a centralized planned economy. As Hayek summarized, the crux of the matter was the impossibility of the rational calculation of a centrally directed economy for which prices are necessarily absent, one which involves planning on a most extensive scale, minute direction of practically all productive activity by one central authority. Thus, the one central authority had to solve the economic problem of distribution, a limited amount of resource between a practically infinite number of competing purposes, with a reasonable degree of accuracy, with a degree of success equally or approaching the result of competing capitalism, is what constitutes the problem of socialism as a method. While this was a common idea in Marxist social democracy and Leninism that came from it, centralized organizations are rejected in anarchism and in this case, anarchist-communism. As Bakunin argued, we are the intellects powerful enough to embrace the infinite multiplicity and diversity of real interests, aspiration, wishes, and needs which sums up the collective will of the people, and to invent a social organization that will not be a Procrustean bed upon which violence of the state will more or less overlay force unhappy society to stretch out. Moreover, a socialist government, unless we endure with the omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence which the theologians attribute to God, could not possibly know or foresee the needs of his people, or satisfy with and even justify those interests which are most legitimate and pressing. For Malatesta, such system will require immense centralization. It will either be an impossible thing to achieve, or if possible, will end up in a colossal and a very complex tyranny. Kropotkin likewise dismissed the notion of central planned economy as the economic change that will result from a social revolution would be so immense and so profound that it would be impossible for one or even a number of individuals to elaborate the social form to which a further society must give birth. The elaborate and new social forms can only be the collective workers of the masses. The notion that a strongly centralized government could command in a precise quantity of a good be sent to such a place on such a day and be received in a given day by a specific official and stored particularly warehouses was not only undesirable but also widely utopian, despite Marxists calling themselves scientific socialists. During his discussion of the benefit of free agreement against state, Tushleg Prokopkin noted that the only form allowed the utilization of the cooperant, the enthusiasm, the local knowledge of the people. Kropotkin's own experience has shown how the high functionaries of the Tsarist bureaucracy were simply charming in their innocent ignorance of the area that were meant to be administrated, and how, thanks to Marxism, the socialist ideal had lost the character of something that had to be worked out by the labor organization themselves and became state management of industry. In fact, state socialism, that is, state capitalism, as an anarchist, he knew that the government become isolated from the masses, so the very success of socialism required the ideas of no government, of self-reliance, of free initiative of the individual, to be preached side by side with those of socialist ownership and production. Thus, it was essential that socialism was decentralized, federal, and participatory, that the structure of the society which we longed for was worked out in theory and practice for beneath, and by all labor unions with the full knowledge of local needs of each trade and each locality. So anarchists can agree with Mises that central planning cannot work in practice as his advocate hope. Or more correctly, Mises agreed with the anarchists as we have opposed central planning first. We have long recognized that no small body of people can be expected to know what happens in society and plan accordingly. Like Isaac Puentes said, no single brain nor any bureau of brains can see this organization. Moreover, there is a pressing question of freedom as well, for a quote by Carlo Cafiero from Anarchy and Communism, the despotism of the socialist state will be equal to the despotism of the present state, increased by the economic despotism of all the capital which will pass into the hands of the state, and the whole will be the multiple by all the centralization necessary for the new state. And it is for this reason that the anarchist friend of liberty, we intend to fight them to the end. End quote. As John O'Neill summarized, the argument against centralized planning is one that has been articulated within the history of socialist planning as an argument for democratic and decentralized decision making. So, for good economic and political reasons, anarchists reject central planning. The central libertarian socialist position feeds directly into refuting Mises' argument, for while a centralized system would need to compare a large infinite number of possible alternatives to a large number of possible needs. This is not the case in a decentralized system. Rather than a vast multitude of alternatives which will swamp a centralized planning agency, one workplace comparing different alternatives to meet the specific needs face a much lower number of possibilities as the objective technical requirement use value. As a project are known, and so local knowledge will eliminate most of the options available to a small number which can be directly compared. As such, removing the assumption of central planning body automatically drains Mises' critique of much of its force, rather than the ocean of possible and conceivable economic combinations. Faced by a central body, a specific workplace or community has more limited number of possible solutions for a limited number of requirements. Moreover, any complex machine is a product of less complex goods, meaning that the workplace is a consumer of others' workplace goods. If, as Mises admitted, a customer can decide between consumption goods without the need for money, then the user and producer of a higher order good can decide between consumption goods required to meet their needs. In terms of decision making, it is true that centralized planning agency will be swamped by multiple options available to it, However, in a decentralized socialist system, the individual workplace and communes will be decisioned between a much smaller number of alternatives. Moreover, unlike a centralized system, the individual form or communes know exactly what is required to meet its need, and so the number of possible alternatives is reduced as well. For example, certain materials are simply technically unsustainable for certain tasks. Means that other assumption is equally flawed. This is what, without the market, no information passed between producers beyond the final outcome of production. In other words, he assumed that the final product is all that counts in evaluating its use. Needless to say, it's true that without more information than the name of a given product, it is impossible to determine whether using it would be efficient utilization of resources, yet more information can provide which can be used to inform decision making. As Adam Week and John Krupp point out, and I quote, at the level of the individual production unit of industry, the only calculation that will be necessary in socialism will be calculation in kind. On the one side will be a recorded resource, material, energy, equipment, labor used up in production, and the others the amount to good products and produce together with any byproduct. Social production is simply production of use value from use value and nothing more. Thus, any good use as an input into production process will require the communication of this kind of information. The generation and communication of such information implies a decentralized horizontal network between producers and consumers. This is because what counts as use value can only be determined by those directly using it. Thus, the production of use value from use value cannot be achieved via central planning, as the central planner had no notion of the use value of the goods being used or produced. Such knowledge lies in many hands dispersed throughout his society, and so socialist production implies decentralization. Capitalist ideologies claim that market allowed the utilization of such dispersed knowledge, but as John O'Neill notes, and I quote, the market way by one way in which dispersed knowledge can be put to good effect, it is not. The only way, the strength of the epistemological argument for the market depends in part on the implausibility of assuming that all knowledge could be centralized upon some particular planning agency. He stressed, but Mrs. argument ignores, however, the existence of a decentralized but predominantly non-market institution for distribution of knowledge. The assertion that only the market can coordinate dispersed non-vocalizable knowledge is false. So in order to determine a specific good is useful to a person, the person needs to know its cost. Under capitalism, the notion of cost has been so associated with price and that we have to put a word cost in quotation marks. However, the real cost of, say, writing a book is not a sum of money, but so much paper, so much energy, so much ink, so much human labor. In order to make a rational decision, whatever a given good is better for meeting a given a need than another, that would be a consumer required this information. However, under capitalism, this information is hidden by the price. Somewhat ironically, given how the Austrian economists tend to stress that the information limitation of the root of its impossibility of socialism, the fact is that the market hides the significant amount of essential information required to make a sensible investment decision. That's why companies like Amazon and Facebook hide their data and reduce the information flow and actually reduce the acceleration of technological progress, especially in fields like AI and information science in general. This can be seen from an analysis of Mises' discussion why labor type cannot replace money as a decision-making tool. Using labor, he argued, leaves the employment of material force of production out of account. The present example of two goods, P and Q, which takes 10 hours to produce, P takes 8 hours of labor plus 2 units of raw material. A which is produced by an hour socially necessary labor. Q takes 9 hours of labor and of 1 unit of A. He asserts that in terms of labor, P and Q are equivalent but in value terms. P is more valuable than Q. The former is false, and the only latter correspond to the nature and purpose of calculation. The flaw in his argument is clear. Assuming that an hour of socially necessary labor is £10, then in price term P will have the £80 or direct labor cost with the £20 of raw material. A while Q will have £90 of direct labor and £10 of A. But both cost £100, so it's hard to see how this corresponds to the nature and purpose of calculation. Using less of a raw material, A is a judgment made in addition to the calculation in this example. The question whether the economies of the use of A simply cannot be made using prices. If P, for example, can only be produced via a more ecologically destructive process than Q, or is a work process by which P is created is marked by dull, mindless work, but Q is more satisfying for the people involved, that Q may be considered a better decision. Sadly, that kind of information is not communicated by the price mechanism. As John O'Neill pointed out, Mises' earlier argument against socialist planning turned on the assumption about consumability. His central argument was that rational economic decision-making required a single measure on the basis of which the work of a alternative state of affairs could be calculated and compared. This central assumption was unchallenged by Taylor and Lange in the defense of socialism, quote unquote, meaning that the foreign state debate against Mises was defensive and based on the argument that socialist planning could mimic the market and produce results which were efficient from a capitalist point of view. Anarchists question whether using price means basing all decision making on one criteria and ignoring all other is a rational thing to do. As O'Neill suggests, the relative scarcity of items hardly exhausts the full the gamut of information that is distributed through society, which might be relevant to a coordination of economic activities and plans. Saying that a good costs, like £10, does not tell you much about the amount of pollution its production or use generates, under what condition labor it has produced, while its price is affected by the market power of the firm producing it, whether it's produced in an ecologically sustainable way, and so forth. Similarly, saying that another similar good costs £9 does not tell you whether that a £1 difference is due to the more efficient use of inputs or whether it is caused by imposing pollution onto the planet. And do price actually reflect class? The question of profit, the reward for owning capital and allowing others to use it, hardly a cost in the same way as labor, resource, so on, attempt to explain profit as an equivalent sacrifice as labor have been ridiculous and quickly dropped. And when looking at prices to elaborate efficiency used for goods, you cannot actually tell the price if it is so. Two goods may have the same price, but profit level under the influence of market power may be such that one has higher cost price than another. The price mechanism failed to indicate that which use less resource as influenced by market power. Indeed, as Taki Futopoulos note, if both central planning and market economy inevitably lead to concentration of power, then neither the former nor the latter can produce the sort of information flows and incentives which are necessary for the best functioning of any economic system. Moreover, a good produced under an authoritarian state will present its workforce could have a lower price than a produced in a country which allows unions to organize as basic human rights. The repression will force down the cost of labor, making the goods in question appear as a more efficient use of resource. In other words, the market can mask inhumanity as efficiency and actually reward the behavior by market share, which has been seen historically and today. In other words, market prices can be horribly distorted that they ignore quality issues. Exchange therefore occur in light of false information, moreover, with anti-social motivation. The maximize short-term sole price for the capitalists regardless of losses to others, thus they distort valuation and impose a crass, narrow, and ultimately self-defeating individualism. Prices are sharp by more than cost, with for example markets, power increase market prices far higher than actual costs. Market prices also fail to take into the account public goods, so biased allocation choice against them, not to mention ignoring the effects of the wider society, i.e. beyond the direct buyers and sellers. Similarly, in order to make a rational decision related to using a good, you need to know why the price is changed for it. If a change is permanent or transient implies different responsive. Thus, the current price is not enough to itself as the good become more expensive temporarily, thus say to a strike. Or is it because of supply, the resource has been exhausted? Actions that are sensible in the former situation will be wrong in the other? As O'Neill suggests, the information in the market is passed back without dialogue. The market informs by exit. Some produce final market, others do not. Voice is not exercised. This failure of dialogue represents the information failure of the market, not a virtue. The market does distribute information, it also bloods a great deal, if not more. So a purely market-based system leaves out information which to base rational resource allocation or the very least hides it. The reason for this, the market system measures at best preferences of individual buyers among the available options. This assumes that all the pertinent use value there are to be outcomes of productions are things that are to be consumed by individuals rather than use value that are collectively enjoyed like clean air. Prices in the market do not measure social cost or externality, meaning that such costs are not reflected in the prices, so you cannot have a rational price system. Similarly, if the market measures prices among things can be monopolized and sold to individuals as distinguished from values that are enjoyed collectively, then it follows that information necessary for rational decision making in production is not provided by the market. In other words, capitalist calculation fails because private firms are oblivious to social costs of their labor and raw material inputs. Indeed, price often misvalue goods as companies can gain a competitive advantage by passing costs onto society in the form of pollution, for example, or de-skilling workers, increased job insecurity, and so on. This externalization of costs is actually rewarded in the market as the consumers seek to lower prices, unaware of the reason why it is lower. Such information cannot be gathered from looking at the prices. Even if we assume that such activity is penalized by finance leader, the damage still done and cannot be undone. Indeed, the company may be able to weather the fines due to profits and is originally made by externality costs. Thus, the market creates a perverse incentive to subsidize their input costs, thought of the Book of Social Environment and Externality. As Noam Chomsky said, it is by now widely realized that the economic externalities can no longer be consigned to footnotes. No one who gives a moment thought on the problem of contemporary society can fail to be aware of the social costs of consumption and production, the progressive destruction of the environment, the utter irrationality of the utilization of contemporary technology, the inability of a system based on profit or growth maximization to deal with the needs that can only be expressed collectively, and the enormous bias this system poses toward maximization of commodity for personal use in place of the general improvement of the quality of life. Price higher than actual cost the production involved for individual society and the environment and instead boils everything down into one factor, namely price. This is a lack of dialogue and information between producers and consumers. Moreover, without using another means of cost accounting instead of price, how can supporters of capitalism know there is a correlation between actual and price costs? One can determine whether such a correlation exists by measuring one against the other. If this cannot be done, then the claim that price and measured cost is tautology, and that price represents a cost and we know that it's cost because it has a price. If, if it can be done, then we can calculate cost in some other sense than in market price, and so argument that only market prices represent cost false. Equally, there may be cost in terms of quality of life issues which cannot be reflected in price terms. Simply put, markets fail to distribute all relevant information, and particularly when prices are at the disequilibrium, can communicate distinctly misleading information. In the words of two South African anarchists, if the price in capitalists provide at best incomplete and partial information that obscure the workings of capitalism, it would generate and reproduce economic and social inequalities. Ignoring the social character of the economy with their methodological individualism, economic liberals also ignore the social costs of particular choices and the question of externalities. This is a quote by Michael Schweickart and Lucien van der Waal by the book Black Flames. This suggests that price cannot be taken to reflect real costs any more than they reflect social expression of the value of goods. They are a result of conflict waged over these goods and those that act their inputs, including of course labor. Markets and social power, much more than need or resource usage, decide the issue in the inequality in the means of purchasers, and the market power, firms, and the bargaining position of labor and capital all play their part. So distortion any relation of price may have its cause in terms of resource use, price are mishappen. Little wonder Kropotkin said whether we are not yet bound to analyze the compound result we call price rather than accept as a supreme and blind ruler of our actions. It is precisely these real costs headed by price which need to be communicated to producers and consumers for them to make informed and rational decisions concerning their economic activity. It is useful to remember that Mises argued that it is the complexity of modern economy that ensures money is required. Within the narrow confines of household economy, for instance, where the father can supervise the entire economic management, it is possible to determine the significant change in the process of production, without such aid the mind as a monetary calculation, and yet with more or less of accuracy. However, the mind of one man alone, be it ever so cunning, is too weak to grasp the importance of any single one among the countless many goods of higher order. No single man can ever master all the possibilities of production as they are, as to be in a position of market straight way evident judgment of value without the aid of some systems of computation. As anarcho-communist society must stress the use various aids to the mind to help individuals and groups to make economic decisions. This will reduce the complexity of economic decision making by allowing different options and resources to be compared to each other. Hence, the complexity of economic decision making in an economy with a multitude of goods can be reduced by the use of rational algorithm procedures and methods to aid the process. Such a tool will aid decision making, not dominate it, as these decisions affect humans and the planet and should never be made automatically. That being the case, anarchist-communist society will quickly develop the means of comparing the real impact of specific higher-order goods in terms of their real cost, i.e. the amount of labor, energy, and raw material used plus any social and ecological plus and costs. Moreover, it should be remembered that production goods are made up on inputs of other goods, that is, higher goods are made up of consumption goods of a lower order. If, as Misuse admits, calculation without money is possible for consumption goods, then the creation of higher order goods can be also achieved and a record of its cost made and communicate those who seek to use it. While the specific aid to the mind, as well as the cost and the relative weight, will be determined by the people of a free society, we can speculate that it will include the direct and indirect labor externality such as pollution, energy use as materials, and so forth. As such, it must be stressed that liberal anarchist communist society will seek to communicate that costs associated with any specific production as well as relative scarcity. In other words, it needs a means of determining the objective or absolute cost associated with different alternatives, as well as an indication of how much of a given good is available at the given of it, i.e., the scarcity. Both of these can be determined without the use of money and markets. Possible frameworks for anarchist economy include suggestions for anarchist communist economic decision-making process. In terms of aids to mind, these include methods to compare goods for resources, allocation by indicating the absolute cost involved in producing a good and relative scarcity of a specific good, among other things. Such a framework is necessary because an appeal to a necessary role for practical judgment in decision-making is not to deny any role to general principle. Neither does it deny any place for the use of technical rules and algorithm procedures. Moreover, there is a necessary role for rules of thumb, standard procedure, the default procedure, and institutional arrangement that can be allowed unreflective and which reduce the scope for explicit judgment, comparing different states of affairs. There are limits in time-efficient use of resource and dispersal of knowledge which require rules and institutions. Such rules and institutions can free us for space and time for reflective judgment where they can matter most. As these rules and institutions need themselves to be open to critical and reflective appraisals. The economic decision, in other words, can be reduced down to one factor, yet Mises argued that anyone who wishes to make calculation in regard to a complicated process of production will immediately notice whether he has worked more economically than others or not. If he finds more references to exchange value obtained in the market that he will not be able to produce profitably, this shows that others understand how to make better use as a higher order goods in question. However, this only shows whether someone who has worked more profitably than others, not whether it is more economical. Market power automatically models this issue. It does the possibility of reducing the monetary cost of production by recklessly exploiting natural resources and labor, polluting or otherwise passing costs on to others. Similarly, the issue of wealth inequality is important, For the production of luxury goods prove more profitable than basic essential for the poor, does this show that the production of the former is better use of resources? And of course, the key issue of the relative strength of market power between workers and the capitalists plays a key role in determining profitability. Basing your economic decision making on a single criteria, namely profitability, can and does lead to perverse results. More obvious, the tendency for capitalists to save money by not introducing safety equipments. To save a dollar, the capitalists build their own railroads poorly, and along comes a train, and lots of people are killed. And what are their lives to him if by their sacrifice has to save money? Similarly, it is considered more efficient to use resources to condemn workers to de-skilling and degrading work, than waste resources in developing machines to eliminate or reduce it. How many machines remain unused solely because they do not return immediate profit to the capitalists? How many discoveries, how many applications of science remain dead letters solely because they don't bring the capitalists enough? And that's a quote that I mentioned from Carlo Cafiero in Anarchy-Communism, and that was in the 1860s or 1870s. Similarly, those investments in which have a higher initial cost but which in the long run will have, say, a smaller environmental impact will be selective in a profit-driven system. This has a seriously irrational effect because the managers of capitalist enterprise are obliged to choose technical means of production which produce a cheapest result. All other considerations are subordinate, in particular the health and welfare of producers and the effective environment. The harmful effects resulting from rational capitalist production methods, as Lumpy pointed out, for example, speed ups, pain, stress, accident, boredom, overwork, long hours, so on, all harm the physical and mental health of those involved, while pollution, the destruction of the environment, the exhaustion of non-renewable resources, and all serious effects on both the planet and those who live on it, as the economist E.S. Schweickart argued. But what does it mean when we say that something is uneconomic? Something is uneconomic when it fails to earn an adequate profit in terms of money. The method economics does not and cannot produce any other meaning. The judgment economic is an extremely fragmentary judgment of the large number of aspects which in real life have to be seen and judged together before a decision can be taken. Economics supply only one, whether a money profit accrues to those who undertake it or not. Schweickart stressed that about the fragmentary nature of the judgment of the economics can be no doubt whatever, even with the narrow compass of economic calculation. These judgments are necessary and methodologically narrow. For one thing, they give a vastly more weight to the short term than the long term. Second, they are based on a definition of cost which excludes all free goods, such as the environment, except for those parts that have been properly appropriated. This means that an activity can be economy although it plays a hell with the environment than a competing activity. If at the same cost it protects and conserves the environment, it will be uneconomic. Moreover, do not overlook the word to those who undertake it. It is a great error to assume, for instance, that the methodology of economy is normally applied to determine whether activity carried out by a group within a society yields a profit to society as a whole. To claim prices includes, all these externalities is nonsense. If they did, we will not see capital moving a third world country with a few or no anti-pollution or labor laws. At best, the cost of pollution will be included in a price if the company was sued successfully in court for damages. In other words, once the damage is done, ultimately, company has a strong interest in buying inputs with the lowest prices, regardless how they are produced. In fact, markets reward such a behavior, as a company which is socially responsible will be penalized by higher costs, and so market prices is reductionist accounting and is accompanying ethics and mathematics, quote unquote, that produce the irrationality of rationality, which place the capitalism exclusive reliance on the price, i.e., profit, to measure efficiency. Ironically enough, Mises also pointed to the irrational nature of the price mechanism. He stated correctly this time that there is extra economic element which monetary calculation cannot embrace because it in its very nature, he acknowledged that these considerations themselves can scarcely be termed irrational, and as an example listed, in any place where man regards as significance the beauty of a neighborhood or a building, the health, the happiness, and the contentment of mankind, the honor of individuals or nations, he also noted they are just as much molded for forces of rational contact as are economic factors, but they do not enter into exchange relationships. How rational is an economic system which ignores the health, happiness, and contentment of people, or the beauty of their surroundings, which, moreover, penalize those who take these factors into consideration? For anarchists, Mises' comment indicate well the inverted logic of capitalism that Mises can support a system which ignores the needs of individuals, their happiness, wealth, surroundings, environment, and so on, by its very nature, says a lot. He suggests that we assign monetary value to such dimensions begs the question, as possibility only if we assume what it's supposed to prove. Indeed, the person who will put a price of friendship simply will have no friends if they simply do not understand what friendship is and thereby exclude from much which is best in human life. Likewise, for other extra economic goods, the individual values such as beautiful places, happiness in the environment, and so on. So essential information required for sensible decision making will have to be recorded and communicate in an anarchist communist society, and you to elaborate different options you see agreed methods of comparison. This differs drastically from the price mechanism as it's recognized that mindless automatic calculations are possible in social choices. Such choices have an unavoidable ethical and social dimension simply because they involve other human beings and the environment. As Mises himself acknowledged, monetary calculation does not capture such dimensions. We therefore need to employ practical judgment in making choices aided by a full understanding of the real social and ecological costs involving using, of course, the appropriated aids to the mind. Given that an anarchist society will be complex and integrated, such aids will be essential, but due to its decentralized nature, it need not embrace the price mechanism. It can evaluate the efficiency of its decision by looking at the real costs involved to society rather than embrace the distorted system of causing the explicit in this price mechanism. As Peter Kropotkin once put it, if we analyze price, we must make a distinction between its different elements. In summary, that Mises considered all essential planning as genuine socialism is false, and meaning that a decentralized anarchist communism was not addressed, weighing up to the pros and cons of how to use millions of different goods in the millions of potential situations that could be used would be impossible in a centralized system, which Leninists, Maoists, Stalinists, Trotsky, as basically any Marxist from the later tradition outward, trying to argue. Yet, in a decentralized communism, there's not an issue. Each individual commune and syndicate will be choosing from the few alternatives required to meet their needs. With the needs known, the alternative can be compared, particularly if agreed criteria aids to the mind are utilized and appropriate agreed information communicated. Efficient economic decision making in a moneyless society economy is possible, assuming that sufficient information is passed between syndicates and communes to elaborate the relative and absolute cost of a good. Thus, decision can be reached with aim to reduce the use of goods in short supply, to which take a large amount of resource to produce, which produce large externalities to create, while a centralized system would be swamped by a large number of different use and combination of goods, and this centralized communist system would not be. Thus, the anarchist communists argue that Mises was wrong. Communism is viable, but only in an anarchist communist society based on the libertarian tradition of socialism. Although the real charge is not that socialism is impossible, but rather it will be inefficient, i.e., it will allocate resources such that too much is used to achieve specific goals, and that there will be no way to check the allocated resources were value sufficient to warrant their use in the first place. While some may portray that as a case of planning against markets, no planning, this is false. Planning occurs in capitalism, as can be seen in any business. It is a question of whether capitalism is sure that no plans can be coordinated and needs meet by means of relative prices and profit loss accounting than by communism, free access to distribution according to need. As such, the question is, does the capitalist system as natural problem through efficient coordination of plans? Anarchist communism argue yes it does. All choices involve lost possibilities, so the efficient use of resources required to increase the possibilities for creating other goods. At best, all you can say is that by picking options which cost the least of market economy will make more resources available for other activities. Yet this assumption crucially depends equating efficiency with profitable, a situation which cannot be predicted beforehand, which easily leads to an inefficient allocation of resources, particularly if we are looking at the meaning of human needs. There are these costs of using money for worth talking opportunity cost of the freeing up a resource for other use than the labor and other resources used to process money. Relative activities should be included. While these activities, banking, advertising, defending property, and so forth, are essential to a capitalist economy, they are not needed in an unproductive from the standpoint of producing use, value, or meeting human needs. This would suggest that an anarchist communist economy will have a productive advantage over the capitalist economy, as the elimination of this structural waste restriction to capitalism will free up a vast amount of labor and materials for socially useful production. This is not to mention the so-called costs, which are no such thing, but relate to capitalist property rights. Thus, rent may be considered a cost under capitalism, but it will disappear if those who use a resource control it rather than pay tribute to gain access to it. As Kropotkin argued, the capitalist system makes use pay for everything free or 4 times its labor value. Thanks to rent, profit, interest, and action of middlemen, such system specific costs hide the actual cost in terms of labor and resource use by increasing the price compared to if we reckon are expensive in labor. Moreover, somewhat ironically, this economic system or resource which the market claims to achieve is not conserve resource for future generation or to ensure environmental stability. Rather, it to allow more goods to be produced in order to accumulate more capital. It would be argued that if the market forces to produce to minimize costs, the associated lower costs will be more likely to result in higher profits. However, this leads to the social impact of such cost cutting out of the equation. For example, imposing externalities on others does reduce a firm price and as a result is rewarded by the market at first glance could be seen as leading to efficient use of resource until such time as the reducer of this becomes clear. Thus goods could be created which do not last as long as they could, which need to constant repairing. So a house produced efficiently under capitalism would be worse place to live simply because the cost was reduced by cutting corners, less insulation, thinner walls, less robust material, etc. In addition, the collective outcome of all these efficient decisions will be socially inefficient as they reduce the quality of life of those subject to them, as well as leading to overinvestment, overproduction, fading profits, and economic crisis. As such, it could be argued that Mises' argument exposed more difficulty for capitalism than for anarchist communism. Finally, it should be noted that most anarchists will question the criteria Hayek and Mises used to judge the relative merits of communism and capitalism, as the former puts the issue was a distribution of income independent of private property in the means of production and a value of input, which was at least approximately the same or even greater than the producer produced under free competition. Thus, the issue is reduced to that of the output quantity, not the issue of free quality. If slavery or Stalinism had produced more output than the free market, the capitalism, that would not make either system desirable. This was in fact a common argument against Stalinism during the 50s and 60s, when it did appear that central party was producing more goods, and ironically, by the proprietarian rights against the welfare state, for it will be remembered that volume of output, like profitability, and so efficiency in the market depends on the income distribution and redistribution from rich to poor, could easily result in more input becoming profitable. Similarly, that capitalism produced more alcohol and Prozac to meet higher demand for dulling the minds of those trying to survive, it would not be an argument against libertarian communism. As we discussed, While anarchists seek to meet the material human needs, we do not aim as under capitalism to sacrifice all other goals to aim as capitalism does. Thus, to the state, the obvious, the aim for maximizing volume output only makes sense under capitalism as a maximum human happiness and liberty may occur with the lower volume of output in a free society. The people of a society without oppression, exploitation, and alienation will hardly act in an identical way nor seek the same value output as those este, in like the capitalist market by those traits. Moreover, the value output is somewhat misleading criteria as it totally ignores its distribution. If the bulk of that value goes to a few, then it has hardly a good use of resource. It is hardly an academic concern and can be seen from Hayek influence to neoliberalism from the 1980s onwards. As economic Paul Krugman notes, the value of the output of an average worker has risen almost 50% since 1973. Yet the growing concentration of income in the hands of a small minority have proceeded rapidly that we are not sure whether the typical American has gained anything from the rising productivity. This means that wealth has flooded upward, and the lion's share of economic growth in America over the past 30 years has gone to a small, wealthy minority. And also, it can be the case in China, which has more billionaires than any other country in the world, and is leading to the same direction as America did in the 70s. To conclude, the capitalist inefficiency is hardly rational, and for a fully human and ecological efficiency in anarchist communism is required. As Punnett and Crump point out, a socialist society still had to be concerned with using resources efficiently and rationally, but the criteria of efficiency and rationality are not the same as they are under capitalism. Under anarchism communism, the decision-making system used to determine the best use of resource is not more or less efficient than market allocation because it goes beyond the market-based concept of efficiency. It does not seek to mimic the market, but to do what market failed to do. This is important because the market is not a rational system it defends often claim. While reducing all decision to one common factor is without a doubt an easy method of decision making, it is also a serious side effect because of its reductionistic basis. The market makes decision making simplistic and generates a host of irrationalities and dehumanizing effects as a result. So to claim that communism will be more efficient than capitalism or vice versa miss the point. Anarchist communism will be efficient in a totally different way, and people will act in ways considered irrational only under a narrow logic of capitalism.